So here we are. I'm Dan Diamond moderating this panel. On my right, Dan Leonard from the National Pharmaceutical Council. To his right, Seema Verma, who runs CMS. To her right, Matt Eyles, who leads AHIP, Health Insurance Plan Lobby. And at the end, Mark McClellan of Duke Margolis and former CMS administrator. So I'd like to get started with this question. Where is Black Bart, and why hasn't he solved drug pricing yet? More seriously, Democrats and Republicans in Congress are pushing forward on drug pricing packages. If those don't succeed, what happens to the health system and the state of drug pricing? How essential is it that those drug pricing packages go through? Dan, you work with Pharma. Why don't you take that first?
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here, and I will take that. But if I could, just offer up two facts that kind of set the groundwork, for me anyway, the things that I think about. In 2019, FDA approved the most expensive drug in history. At the same time, 2019, we have seen the slowest growth in the overall drug trend year over year in over 25 years at less than half of 1%. And I just bring that up to say, we have a lot of these conversations, there's a lot of meetings like this that I go to, and when we talk about drug pricing, we have to, I think, qualify that the vast majority of patients with chronic disease who are receiving treatment are getting a very good value for the drugs that they take. Yes, we have very expensive new treatments that are groundbreaking, and they are life-changing and life-saving for the patients that are on them. But there's a big difference. So I just like to set the groundwork.
Translating that message, are you saying that there isn't a drug pricing problem if we're in this moment where pricing
No.
is flattened?
Well, the final point that I was going to make, it is working for many, but it's not working for everyone. And until it is working for everyone, we need to be having these conversations. So I'm pleased to be here and be part of this. The question is, is the sky falling? Will we implode if there is no drug pricing package to come out of this Congress this year? I think as a republic, we will continue and carry on, but there is important work that needs to be done. Senator Cassidy just spoke to much of that and was very eloquent on that point.
Administrator Verma?
Well, I think we have to take action on drug pricing. If we look at the whole healthcare system as a whole, we know that costs have continued to rise, and even though we've had lots of different action over the last 10, 20 years, the rate of growth of healthcare continues. And we're predicting by 2026 that we'll be spending $1 in every $5 on healthcare. That's not sustainable for the country, and we're seeing lots of Americans that are being left behind. And so as we're having conversations about the future of healthcare and how we manage it, addressing drug costs is critical. It's one of our fastest growing areas of spend. And you alluded to the fact that we have even more high-cost drugs that are coming to market. From where I sit, we're seeing the advent of drugs that are costing $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, and there's about 50 more of these in the pipeline. So we're already having problems with this. The system's not sustainable as is. We're very hopeful that we'll have a passage of bipartisan legislation to address this issue. That being said, if not, the administration is prepared to move forward. We've got some proposals out there. I think some of the work that we've already done has been significant. Part D premiums have actually gone down. We're seeing some of the lowest levels that we've seen in the past 7 years, lowest levels in 7 years, and premiums have gone down by 11%.
You mentioned what the administration is prepared to do and what has already happened. The International Pricing Index that has been looming out there is something that the administration could roll out. What's the status of the IPI?
Right now it's sitting at OMB. Things go through its very bureaucratic process. That's about all I can say.
That's all you can say publicly, or you know more?
It's sitting at OMB.
We have a major pricing problem in this country. I mean, as we've seen not just the cost of pharmaceuticals increase, we've seen ever higher prices, and it seems like every manufacturer is looking what the last manufacturer did with respect to price and seeing how they can outdo them. And while some of the innovations have been remarkable, when you're talking about a product that may cost $500,000, to put it in context, right? You could provide comprehensive health insurance coverage for 30 families for the price of one drug. I think we need to think about what the right balance is, and I appreciate the need for innovation. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for more than half my career, and I know the good work that is being done there. But something has happened over the past decade to really tilt the balance such that pharmaceutical manufacturers are not just sort of gaming the system on existing products. And the comment by Senator Cassidy about profitability, it's one thing profitability on new products, it's profitability on products that probably should have generic, biosimilar, or other competitors that's being precluded that I think is really draining the system. So we want to see a bipartisan package. We think that there's a problem. It should make sure that premiums don't increase. For seniors, it should provide out-of-pocket cost protection. And it should make sure that pharmaceutical manufacturers have meaningful liability for the cost and the price of their products, particularly throughout the benefits. So we think that there's an important way to move forward, but it's a heavy lift.
Just following up on something that Senator Cassidy and I were discussing, whether pharma has been responsible. You were in pharma, you're out of pharma. How responsible is the industry?
All right, so a quick story. When I was in the industry, I sat in literally dozens of pricing committee meetings about the launch price of new products or about price increases on old products. Let me tell you how many times someone asked the question, how much did we spend on research and development for this product? What do you think the answer was? 0. No one ever asked that question, right? Because it's not about how much you spend on research and development, it's what can you get on the current market conditions for the price of that product. So the price starts with the manufacturers. They set it, and they set it alone. They alone decide when to increase prices. So I think that's really where it stops and ends.
Well, since Matt went to that talking point about setting the price, I'm obligated to go to the rest of the story, which is what happens between the list price and the net price, often referred to as the gross to net bubble, which is up to $160 billion annually that is changing hands between manufacturers and health plans, PBMs, employers, but very little is getting back to the patient. So there is an issue there. Houston, we do have a problem there. And I also would push back on Matt a little on the R&D question. Billions of dollars are spent on researching the next cures that are coming out. We've had a conversation around some of these exceptional new treatments for very rare diseases like spinal muscular atrophy for children. They're amazing treatments where there was no treatment before. And yes, they are going to provide benefit to that patient over a lifetime, but the system is still built such that it has to get paid for in one fiscal year. So that is a payment system, basically a fee-for-service payment system that hasn't evolved as quickly as the science.
Mark, you're a professor. Who's right?
Look, there's obviously room for improvement on all sides here. Maybe talk like an academic. But to talk more politically, I think the American public is really not going to be satisfied if there isn't some kind of action, either legislatively or administratively. President Trump has made that clear as well. So something's going to happen, if not by the end of the year, by soon after. And I think that's appropriate because although there has been important progress in drug affordability and access, along with the changes that we've seen in innovation that we've just been talking about, at the same time, the world is changing. There are more treatments around, as Dan said, that are about cures and about long-term benefits that are very important for people who have unmet medical needs today. That's not the case, or wasn't nearly as much the case back when we implemented Part D in 2006. And if you look ahead, hopefully the future is going to be a lot more about early diagnosis and then treatments that can be done outside a hospital, ideally through something like a gene therapy or something else that's one time, and then you can move on. That's a very different model from what we've been paying for in the past. And just want to pick up on, make sure we cover the Senator's question, Senator Cassidy's question for this panel, which is how do we make the healthcare affordable? How do we make it possible for people to get not only the new drugs, but all these other innovations that are coming that really can transform lots of diseases, both chronic conditions like cancer and AIDS, which have reflected some progress from medical technology already, but where much more can come. And I really want to give the administration some credit too for moving forward on new payment models, new ways of supporting integrated care for people and getting the right treatment to the right patient. Hopefully we'll see some more bipartisan progress on that front as well.
Well, staying on that point, the idea of pushing for better health, even if at times the system is not set up for it, antibiotics, they're not high priced. Some of the incentives aren't there for the industry. What can be done to encourage more investment in, say, antibiotic development?
Well, that's a great example of some of the perverse incentives inside drug pricing that I think the government has actually set up. So there was a lot of government support for the development of these antimicrobials. But then they would come to CMS, and the way we pay it inside how we pay for all antibiotics. And so obviously a lot of antibiotics are priced lower, so there really wasn't an incentive for the market to continue the investment. And we've seen problems in this. So there's been some limitations. We just took action on this particular area by increasing the amount of reimbursement for these types of drugs. And we're saying that, for the first couple of years, anything that's one of these antimicrobials that have been approved by FDA, they can get a higher payment. So there are some ways to do that, but I think it really sort of speaks to the point that if the government policy isn't set appropriately, it can really thwart innovation. And one of the things that we have to be careful of is we want to encourage innovation, but we also don't want to create a system that encourages higher spending. The Part B program in and of itself, the way that it's set up is average sales price plus a percentage add-on payment for physicians. So a couple of things, that encourages manufacturers to have a higher price, and it encourages physicians to prescribe a higher price drug. So I think as we're thinking about solutions, we have to ensure that we're not creating perverse incentives either way. For antimicrobials, we want to encourage the development, but I also don't want to create a system that encourages $1 million antimicrobial.
The Congressional Budget Office took a look at the Democrats' bill in the House and said that while it would save money, it could lead to less innovation, as many as 15 fewer drugs developed over a decade. So this idea of saving money, trade-off with innovation has circulated amid this broader debate. Is that a fair question to be wrestling with? Can we cut the cost of drugs while preserving innovation at the same time? Matt.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And before I even got to the pharmaceutical industry, I worked at the Congressional Budget Office. And I have immense respect for the analysts there. They do amazing work. I'm not quite sure that that's actually going to happen, right? If your lifeblood is inventing new cures, right? If your sole purpose for being is developing new drugs, are you going to stop the development? I think it will change some of the calculations about where investment is made. I'm not sure I entirely agree with the conclusion that will absolutely lead to fewer drugs down the road. I think there will be different kinds of innovations that it will have to spur. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not, but I'm not entirely convinced that that is a foregone conclusion.
Just to add to that I would say that true innovation is not only the science behind the drug, but making sure that the drug is accessible. It doesn't mean anything if you have a wonderful drug that nobody can access or can afford.
Dan?
Well, I would just say I think CBO did a fine analysis. It's pretty basic mathematics, if you will. The revenue model generates the revenue and is a percentage of the revenue for the pharmaceutical company that goes back into R&D. So if the revenue is cut, the R&D budgets will be cut. So that the number of new drugs that may not come out, as you mentioned, Dan, 10 to 15 drugs. Well, that's a significant number. It's even more significant if you have a family member with that in that disease area that is now not getting a treatment, or it is likely that the potential new drugs that would not be, that go through the process would be the hard ones. They'd be the difficult ones, the tough nuts to crack. And so Alzheimer's has come up already today, but that's a very difficult one. As a country, we really can't afford not to solve the Alzheimer's equation because it's $368 billion a year and a burden to our society as it is. So there is a very legitimate concern about the amount of new innovation that would occur if that particular policy were to go into play.
Yeah, I actually think there's pretty good evidence from economic studies that if what you did was reduce the payments within our current system for drugs, there will be an impact on innovation. Senator Cassidy was pretty eloquent about that earlier. I think some of the economists differ on how big the effect is. If you go back to when Medicare was first formed, there's actually a huge impact subsequent to that on innovation and care related to the elderly. And there have been similar studies both in the US and internationally about the impact of changes in payment. Where I think I agree with Matt on this, though, is that the incentives that we have now, and Seema too, that the incentives we have now don't necessarily encourage this really high value innovation. We talked about some of the loopholes earlier. Some of Matt's plans are actually taking some really interesting steps to do things like avoid that 6% markup on Part B drugs, which if you're talking about $1 million drug is a huge amount of additional payments going to a hospital or a physician. There's got to be a more efficient way to do that.
Can we name a plan, just for example? What's a plan that has done well here?
What's that? So, I mean, there's a number of plans that have moved into especially value-based arrangements that have been very public. So you've seen it from Cigna, from Harvard Pilgrim, so right, a large national company, medium-sized regional company. We've seen lots of experimentation with these value-based payment arrangements. And I think there's a lot of progress that we're seeing. They're also very complicated because how a product performs in the real world, in a real patient population, may be very different than what is approved on the label because of how it was approved through the clinical trial process, right? So these are complicated arrangements, and we support the move towards value-based payment arrangements for pharmaceuticals, right? This is the way that our system needs to go. But it's not so simple as just saying, let's put on a value-based arrangement for every single drug out there in the market.
Yeah, I would say, just to reinforce this point, that most payments in general in healthcare still aren't this way yet. Administrator Verma has taken some big steps to try to advance CMS's support of payments to healthcare providers that are really more about outcomes and flexibility and how those outcomes are achieved by supporting a lot of things that aren't paid for today and avoiding even more things that are and that are potentially unnecessary or wasteful or low value care. But it does require a different approach to not just putting a whole lot of administrative effort into checking the boxes on process measures of quality or CPT codes, but really putting the effort into an infrastructure around tracking what matters to patients and their clinicians. But that's where we should be going anyway for healthcare overall, and it's certainly where we should be going for supporting and rewarding the right kind of innovation in pharma.
I think that there's been a lot said about value-based, and we're certainly very supportive. It's one of our top priorities at the agency. And we're supportive of experimenting with this in terms of pharmaceuticals. We're going to be taking some action at the agency to make it easier for the private industry to do these types of things. They usually have an impact on Medicaid best price because under the law, you have to make sure that Medicaid is getting the best deal. And so if you create one of these value-based arrangements, it's possible that if you're giving away the drug for free, if it didn't work, then you have some problems on the Medicaid side. So we're trying to address that. That being said, I think we should be cautious on this. One of my main concerns with value-based drug pricing is that it may lead to higher launch prices because manufacturers, if they understand that, okay, we're going to give you a discount if the drug didn't work or you don't have to pay if the drug didn't work, then that kind of gets built into the base costs of the drug. So yeah, I think it's generally a good thing that we're moving towards value-based and holding providers accountable for cost and quality. So I think you can bring that into it, but we have to be careful about what that might do to the initial launch price.
So it's maybe a both and, both the value steps and steps to make those negotiations around price work out better than they have in some cases.
And I would just add, I agree with everything that's been said on this topic. It's an important topic. It's an important area where there's aggressive work and agreement between Matt's members and my members, and I wanted to tip my hat to the administrator and CMS for the work they have been doing on reforms that are necessary in Medicaid best price and the Stark law. But yeah, so I think this is the direction we need to go as we move our entire healthcare system to one that is more value-based versus fee-for-service based. This is a natural. I think we're still in early days on this within the pharmaceutical sector, but hopefully we can see many more contracts like this in the future.
A Kaiser Family Foundation poll out this month found that nearly 9 in 10 Americans favor allowing the federal government to negotiate with drug companies to get a lower price on medication for people who are covered by Medicare, about 88%, so 9 out of 10. Just show of hands from the crowd, or actually no, clap if you support the idea of allowing the government to directly negotiate on Medicare drugs. So, solid response. Show of hands from this panel. Who supports direct negotiation?
That's kind of a broad question, right?
Yeah.
Is it that broad? I mean, it's an idea that the president has touted before. It's an idea that the American public is attached to. Why aren't you in favor of it?
You're looking at me?
You go first.
I'll
You go first. You're
we
set up
had,
Part D, right?
you were quoting, I think, was a 2005 Kaiser poll in the last
In
panel.
the earlier one, that was a 2005 poll. This is a brand new poll that Kaiser
Right, and you know, we've had this discussion, Dan, for quite a while, is just my point. And this reminds me of the pre-Part D implementation days where people were rightly concerned that there wasn't enough negotiation going on their behalf to bring down the prices of the drugs that they needed to use. The way Part D worked out, it was a predominantly, but not only Republican bill, was to empower a lot of negotiation, but through the private sector, through plans that people had a choice of. So if they wanted to go to a plan that was pretty aggressive, relatively aggressive about its formularies and the like, and maybe was able to get lower prices, but maybe not quite as much access to as many drugs, they would have an opportunity to do that. If they wanted to go to a plan that provided broader coverage, that would be available too. And as the administrator said, the prices overall and the spending overall with Part D, the premiums and the like, has been way lower than expected, with bigger price discounts than what Matt's friends at CBO projected at the time. What's, I think, changed since then is that we're seeing a lot more drugs in Part B that have high costs, that are administered by physicians, and that include things like, potentially things like gene therapy or CAR T therapies, where there's not this kind of mechanism in place. And on the Part D side, a lot more drugs that, as we've just been hearing about, are specialized or targeted and are actually can be quite effective for unmet needs in specialized populations. That's maybe 1 or 2% of people, but a much larger share of cost now. When Part D was set up, most drug costs were not in that so-called catastrophic category, and the Part B costs, the physician-administered drug costs, were a lot lower. So those are areas where I would agree with the administrator that more steps are needed now to improve the way that negotiation works. I just don't think we've set up our current systems to enable a lot of that. And the Part D catastrophic benefit today, the vast majority of those costs are paid for by the federal government without negotiation. So I understand why people would say, well, why are we just subsidizing these high-cost drugs, as opposed to, now that we have a lot more experience with how drug insurance can work, why not rely on Matt's plans, hold them more accountable to keep those costs down too.
I think from my perspective, we support negotiation. We want more negotiation. The question is, who is the negotiator? I get very concerned about big government solutions. I mean, the government hasn't delivered in so many different ways. I think what works best is competition and negotiation.
So Administrator, in the Democrats' bill, these aren't just unnamed bureaucrats, but specifically empower HHS Secretary. In this case, HHS Secretary is Alex Azar, your boss. Do you not trust the secretary to handle negotiations?
I don't think we should I don't think that we should put that much power and authority in the hands of government. I think that's problematic. I think we've got to have some humility in our government and recognize that the government isn't this omnipotent force that's going to deliver lower costs. We've had so many problems in healthcare that can be rooted back to government policy, and it's very difficult to move things in the government. You've got to go through Congress to make changes. I think what Mark has outlined in terms of having negotiators on our behalf, the good negotiators survive, the bad ones don't, but ultimately the most important thing is that people have choices about the plans that work best for them. When you have the government negotiating, it's one plan. It's a one-size-fits-all for everybody. Allowing private negotiators to do that on our behalf allows the American people to have choices, and they can pick a plan that's going to work best for them. I don't want to have just one choice and have the government make all the decisions for me.
Just staying on you for a second, you mentioned that you don't want the government to be omnipotent, that maybe some power should be dispersed. Are there things that you wish you didn't have the power to oversee, even beyond drug prices, that should go to someone else?
We try, at least at CMS these days, I try to approach my work with humility to understand that we don't know everything. We're in DC, there's innovation going on across the whole country, there's providers on the front lines that have a very good idea of what's going to work and what's not going to work, and so we try to work with the industry to craft solutions. I think the idea that folks in Baltimore are going to come up with the best ideas, and no, I've been there, I'm doing it, and I don't think that that's an appropriate solution.
Matt?
So I think it's a little bit of a false choice because we have to differentiate when competition exists and when it doesn't, right? And I think that's really what we're trying to balance, because there are cases when there really is no competition, therapeutic, biosimilar, generic, right, from when there is competition. And that's the system that we need to set up, is how do we try and create more competition when it doesn't exist? Because in that case, we're really just, essentially price takers, because the patent is essentially guaranteeing a monopoly, and everyone else knows the sort of rest of the story there. Question is, how do you empower private sector tools and negotiations, create a system that gets to that outcome? Because as Dan sort of mentioned at the beginning, with the rebate bubble or the list, right, that's because plans are good negotiators when there's something to negotiate. So the manufacturers have increased list prices as they've been forced to negotiate lower prices through rebates, and that's why they've increased the list prices, because there's not every company out there that they're going to have a contract with, and some people are going to be paying that inflated list price, right? But when competition exists, we've shown through Part D, through other programs, that the private sector and plans and PBMs and others can operate pretty effectively.
If I could just jump in on this, the competition is obviously critical to the whole conversation. 3 litmus tests I would give on the legislation anyway. First of all, is it bipartisan? Senator Cassidy was very eloquent on the importance of bipartisanship. If it is not bipartisan or 100% one way or the other, it's probably, there's some skepticism around it, so that would be what I would look at. 2 other litmus tests would be just patient access. Would this or could this potentially have a negative impact on patient access to cures, to therapies? And I think there is definitely a possibility that if there is government price setting, and it's really not as much a negotiation as this is the number, you must live to this number, that could impact patient access. And then third, back where we started around innovation, will this have an impact, negative impact on innovation? And using this kind of the same math that we were talking about a few minutes ago, I think it would have a negative impact on the next generation of therapies.
Dan, your organization is funded by pharma. Is there a company that you would point to as doing drug pricing right?
Well, I am not going to pick out one of my companies, some of whom are in this room, but I think they are all...
This is a chance to celebrate.
Well, how much...
Are they not
name 23
worth celebrating from stage?
Yes, they're all worth celebrating, and they're all worth bringing these amazing cures to reality. These are...
So which one is doing it best?
I'm not going to name... I'm not going there, Dan. They're all doing an exceptional...
He loves all his children equally.
Yeah.
even if they're all in detention. I mean, the idea that the drug industry has done right here, how much burden should the industry bear on fixing these problems, and how much should we trust pharma to fix problems that the industry may have created?
Well, I think it's been, there's plenty of responsibility to go around. There is certainly responsibility that my members take. If I could, we published a study, the National Pharmaceutical Council, recently that looked back 20 years on the 7 leading causes of death and disability, and then marched forward those 20 years and showed, as you could imagine, significant health improvement in HIV and in lung cancer and cardiovascular and a number of diseases. And then when you factor in inflation costs and prevalence, the actual cost of treating those diseases is either flat or slightly down. So over time, these therapies that many were perceived as very expensive in their early days are now treatments for chronic diseases, and millions of people are getting treated effectively. So there's a long story here, and there is a great trend within our industry of bringing these cures forward. And there is a significant concern that if we disrupt that process, the next generation of therapies and cures will not be there.
So what I think is so concerning, though, is the year-over-year price increases on the same old product, right, that was launched in 2002, that still doesn't have competition, and that we've continued to see increase, once or twice a year for years and years. And there are products that were approved when President Clinton was in office, and we don't have generic competition or biosimilar competition, right? Like, that's just wrong. We should be able to realize the benefits. The return on investment has clearly happened, and that's why we've seen actions by manufacturers, right, to stop biosimilar competition, because each year that they're able to get without another product on the market means billions and billions of dollars. And I think that's really what's frustrating so many people in the system, is the same old product year after year increasing in price when we don't experience that, certainly not at the same level in any other sector of the economy.
I think the other point that I would make is that you brought up when the first high-cost drug, I think it was the hepatitis drugs, came out, there was 60 grand. And people were aghast.
More than that.
More than that.
That would have been a great discount.
But people were aghast at that price. And at that point, there was just so much concern at that point. Now, that was years ago. And now we have a $500,000 drug. Now we have a $1 million drug, a $2 million drug. And so the question is, when does that end? At what point do we say, this is too much and it's too high? Are we going to go to $5 million or $10 million? Because we didn't take action many years ago, we're now continuing on this path where we're just pricing on what basis? On what basis do you come up with a figure of $2 million? And where does this end? If we don't take action now, this trend of these super high-cost drugs and no limitations and the ability for pharmaceutical companies to price really whatever they want is going to be a real concern to the sustainability of the whole healthcare system.
Just a couple of comments to build on these really good points. One is that, I think to Matt's point too, it's one thing to have a new drug that comes on the market and meets an unmet medical need and gets rewarded for that financially. These are often risky products to produce. They take a lot of investment. They take a lot of time. A lot of important steps have been underway to reduce those development costs, but still, it's not easy, and these drugs are really valuable to the people, or can be really valuable to people who benefit. I think that the other side of that, though, is that shouldn't last forever, as you're saying. And the Hep C case, it didn't. Within a couple of years, there were other drugs on the market, and if we had gone with a regulated price at not $85,000, even $60,000, that would have ended up being a big loss by 2 years later. And the reason that we can have conversations now about Medicaid programs in Washington and other places, potentially treating everyone with Hep C, all these lower income and individuals who have not had access so far, is because of those competitive price reductions. But I think there probably are some other steps around biosimilars and the like that could also help move in that direction. Beyond that, though, there is this question about how much are we willing to pay for a new drug that doesn't have any competition. This country's had a hard time coming to terms with that. You know, the same Congress that set up Part D with some price negotiation, with some considerable price negotiation ability, didn't, gave a lot of reinsurance and a lot of limitations on that competition for high-cost drugs, and also put in some restrictions now in legislation that every single cancer drug has to be covered on formulary, every single immunologic drug, and this is in a time when there are a lot of alternatives available. So there are some ways to start making progress, I think, on the high price issues that you're worried about that at least to me don't seem as much basic threats to innovation around really valuable drugs as some of the other proposals have.
We are getting tight on time, so perhaps a last question for the panel, starting with Mark and then working our way down. If you were able to see through one regulation, one change at the federal level, what would it be on drug pricing?
Gosh, just one. I think I'd continue doing a lot of the things that Administrator Verma is trying to do. She talked about the regulatory changes to make it easier to get into value-based contracts that really do bring costs down and improve outcomes, not just for drugs, but aligning it with all of healthcare. I guess the other thing that I'd like to see, and this is, as Matt said, a big change, is getting us away from paying for drugs, especially these high-cost drugs that have long-term benefits, and antibiotics and the like, getting away from paying on a volume basis for those. Let's do a real outcome-based approach, like Senator Cassidy was talking about. Yes, that would require tracking outcomes over time. Yes, it would require changing some other regulations to get away from our whole fee-for-service, rebate-based approach. But we've seen some models of how this can work, and it would be so much better for encouraging the use, the development of antibiotics that are only used for people who really need it, but that protect the rest of the population and have lots of value that's just not captured in fee-for-service. And this would be great for some of these new therapies that really are expected to last potentially a lifetime, but we just don't know yet because they've only been tested for a couple of years, and they're also probably going to get better over time. Let's get away from fee-for-service payment.
So I would go to giving plans more flexibility, particularly in the Medicare program, and Administrator Verma and CMS has really been pushing this, but there are some limits to how far they can go and really allowing private sector plans to manage the benefit completely, whether you're talking about medical benefit drugs, pharmacy drugs, and really being able to leverage private sector negotiation tools. There's a lot of negotiation that goes on, but there's still some limitations, although those are probably more statutory than some of the regulatory ones.
From my standpoint, I think where we need to take action, or what's really crying out for, or the problem that needs to be addressed the most, is in the Part B program. This is the physician-administered drugs. That's where I feel like the way the program is set up, it's set up to encourage more high-cost drugs. And so to be able to bring in better negotiation and competition into that area would be great. I also think that Part D is working well, but it does need some reforms. It needs some updating for us to be able to address the catastrophic phase would be critical. There's a lot of support, bipartisan support for making those changes. I think that could have a tremendous impact in lowering out-of-pocket expenses for seniors.
So I'm going to go similarly to where Mark was, but it could be legislation that doesn't exist yet. So I will. 2 days ago, the fantastic team here at Faster Cures had a roundtable with Congressman Fred Upton, he and his partner in crime, Diana DeGette, are looking at a 21st Century Cures 2.0 version. And the first version of that was very groundbreaking and has, I think, led to a lot of the faster approvals at FDA and some of the therapies that we're now seeing. So I think, hopefully, in the next version of that, and Senator Cassidy touched on some of this, would be innovative payment systems that line up with the innovative science that we're seeing, so that a treatment that gives decades of benefit to a patient does not have to be paid for in one single calendar year, but gets spread out and meets the life cycle of that patient.
Actually, one last question. I'm struck that you're all either Republicans, former appointee, current appointee, have been Republican staffers or donors in the past.
I've been a Democratic appointee too, so.
Excuse me?
I was a Democratic appointee first, President Clinton, so.
But unlike me, unlike most of us, you have been appointed to a Republican administration. Who is the smartest Democrat on drug pricing? Is it Representative DeGette, Bernie
Look, I'll give you a non-answer, and then I apologize. I was going to like storm out of here and make a big dramatic scene, but I have to leave a few minutes early to catch a train.
He really does have to leave.
But in another, this is going to sound diplomatic. We do a lot of work right now with people who are Democratic leaders in states. People who are working on legislation on the Democratic side. It was an event with Wendell Primus not that long ago. These are people who are trying hard on some of these issues too, and they don't, they have different ways of seeing the problem, but there are a lot of thoughtful people on both sides, which gives me some optimism that we can actually have some bipartisan legislation on this.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.
You're not all off the hook yet. Administrator Verma, your favorite Democrat?
I'm not going to name names, but I will say that I think that our public servants don't always get a lot of appreciation. I will tell you that there are folks on both sides of the aisle that are deeply committed to trying to address this issue. One of the things that we do at CMS is we provide technical assistance, and so we can see who's doing what and what they're working on. And I'm very encouraged that there are folks on both sides of the aisle that are very dedicated, very committed. At the end of the day, they understand that Americans are fed up and they're tired of having to go to Canada to get lower-priced insulin, and they're dedicated to trying to come up with a solution. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Dan Leonard?
Well, I'm actually prohibited from lobbying and advocacy. So in my organization, NPC, we don't get involved in politics. So I'm going to take a pass on that, and I have to go. No, but I will reaffirm what I said a little while ago, that let's just start with a bipartisan approach. So if we can get one Democrat and one Republican who have a good idea together, and then many flowers bloom, that's the best way to approach these issues, in my opinion.
Matt, are we going to hear a name from you, or?
No, I mean, like within the Congress, there are a lot of people who have been taking leadership around this, and to point to the obvious ones, right? The chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, right, Pallone, and Anna Eshoo, the subcommittee chair. Right? They've been spending a lot of time on drug pricing. They've been giving a lot of thought to it. Chairman Pallone's from New Jersey. He has a lot of pharmaceutical companies in his backyard. He's obviously been thinking about these issues for a very, very long time.
Okay. Some lawmakers to watch and some people to watch making drug pricing changes. Dan Leonard, Administrator Verma, Matt Eyles, thank you so much.